I'm going to get paid 50% more, I think, this year, putting together that seminar group list beats the 12 labors of Hercules. I mean, my email box was inundated. Every 5 minutes, someone saying, ooh, I can't do 4 o'clock. Ooh, I can't do 5 o'clock. I can't do this and I can't do that. And I think, God's sake, can't you guys, A, look at Keats quite regularly, work out what your problems are, and send me one email saying, I can't do this. And secondly, you can't say, oh, I want to go to archery class. The only basis on which a seminar group can be altered, transferred, is on the basis of a clash with a lecture, okay? So please don't apply on the basis of some other reason. I can't do it. Reason is, the guys who organize the rooms have got a real task of finding rooms which actually fit a class of 25 or 30. And therefore, we need to slot into that. If you guys keep changing around, there's not going to be any seats in those classes, okay? So please, can we take this seriously? I mean, after all, you guys want to go work in international finance, right? Yeah, there's a Morgan Stanley and a Goldman Sachs sitting out there who don't take this kind of thing as a joke. You please, okay, approach it in a little bit more serious manner. I think it's rather important. Couple of other things I wanted to tell you. Quite a few people have been sending me emails saying, sorry, I've got to go to, I don't know, whether it's Rome or wherever it is. There's a problem with this because even now I notice the class seats are empty compared to what it was 2 weeks ago. I hope they've dropped the module because these topics that I'm going through now, and I want to emphasize this very much, run right through the topics in the module. Every one of the topics in the module will be affected by what I'm talking about now. So if you missed out all that stuff about Rome 1 and Rome 2 and all of that stuff, please get to grips with it now. Look up the lecture capture, which is what you've got, and try to get to grips with it, okay? And here's one more piece of advice I give every year. Don't treat this module as something you can do the way I think most of us did undergraduate, saying, I'll skip that topic, I'll skip that topic, I'll do this one, and I'll do that one. You can't do it that way. This is a fully integrated module. Each topic flows into the next one. The only way I can describe it is like building something. You put the foundations, then you put the bricks on top, then you build the walls, and you keep going, right? If you think you can come in at wall level without a foundation, you're kidding yourself. Okay, so please don't try to do that. You can't do this on I'll pick this topic but not that one. Can't be done on that basis, okay? It's not like company law where you can say, oh, I'll skip minority shareholders' rights. I'll just look at ultra vires. Can't be done like that, okay? Please remember this. Second thing I want to emphasize before you go ahead with this module is that this is not about reading and reading and reading journal articles and Professor this said, Professor Y said this, and Professor X said that. No. Remember, this is a practitioner-oriented course. So it's not about reading 85 articles. If you look at the reading list, there aren't many to read, nor are there cases to read. Because your work is going to be actually not reading endlessly, but thinking about how what you pick up at lectures in particular, and whatever short reading you do, which is on the reading list, what you need to work out is how to operate these things that you know in relation to one very important thing that this module and all the LOIF modules are trying to impart to you. How to advise a client. How do you deal with a client's problem to advise? And that's why the seminars that we're going to be doing are fact pattern driven, and you will be required to prepare written advice and present it as if you were at a meeting. That's the purpose of it. We're not going to be saying, so what do you think of Professor X's viewpoint on this? We don't care is the answer. What a client wants to know is, here's my problem, How do you solve it? What's your advice? Stop. No one's going to ask you, have you read this article, that case? Nobody gives a damn. That's why this is about how you do things in real life. Okay? I'm just telling you this. And please make it a point to come into these seminars and forget about Facebook and your neighbor and concentrate. And please don't complain if you fail, if you don't do this. Okay? Please take it seriously. I'm telling you now not to just let things ride. And that's why I keep on saying, if you don't understand something, for goodness sake, raise your hand at lectures and ask. And I'm perfectly happy to repeat myself twice, 3 times, as long as you understand it. Because my job is to make you understand things, understand complex things easily. So if you can't do that, then turn up at the seminars, and the seminars will have 2 objectives. One is to explore the subject in more detail, deal with some of the problems you have, and then look at fact patterns and how to write advice. So take the opportunity and do it, okay? Because otherwise, by late semester, many people will be talking complete. Try to come in early because, you know, it's all right. Okay, we're done. Moving on to the first transactional topic. I'm going to talk about syndicated loans for the next upcoming few weeks. Now, you will see what I said in practice now. Namely, that if you didn't understand Rome 1, you went to Rome while I was talking about Rome 2, you're going to have a problem when I start talking about international syndicated loans. Okay? Important. I don't want to get emails saying, sorry, I got to go off and see somebody in Madrid or Barcelona or Rome or Madrid or Japan for that matter. You need to get to grips with this stuff. If you don't, follow the lecture capture. Okay? And if you've got problems, questions, come into class and ask. Don't let it ride and think, yeah, I'll clear it up in February. Can't be done, okay? So, you see what I'm talking about when I start talking about the first transactional topic, syndicated loans. Because what I talked about with Rome 1 and Rome 2 comes straight into what I'm going to talk about now. So first, let's ask ourselves a very straightforward question, which is, how do I get this to work? No. Okay. What is an international syndicated loan? Let's get that clear in our heads, and then we'll start doing the lawyering. First of all, it's a loan made to a single borrower, usually in several currencies. Thus, it's called multi-currency loans. Those currencies which are the subject of the lending are those which can be used in the global markets. And usually, for the moment, it happens to be the US dollar, the euro, the Japanese yen, Singapore dollars, Australian dollars, New Zealand dollars, and the like. The one big currency which has yet to come into this market is the Chinese renminbi. At the moment, the 2 biggest currencies used in this market are the US dollar and the euro. But believe me, when the renminbi comes in, it will be the 3rd largest segment of this global market. But for the moment, we're not there yet. Now, having said that it's a single borrower borrowing in several currencies, and the lending is being done by a whole number of global banks, sometimes these syndicates of banks, the group of banks, we call a syndicate from now on, the numbering is about 250 banks. It's that large because the amounts you're talking about, which are the subject of the syndicated loans, are massive. A $1 billion or a $2 billion loan is a small loan. 20 billion, 30 billion kind of numbers you're talking about. These are huge. The second thing you need to remember is that the lending in all these currencies by 150 banks plus is being done under the terms of a single loan agreement. The syndicated loan agreement, in future I shall refer to it as SLA, syndicated loan agreement, under one syndicated loan agreement. Who are the borrowers? Well, they are essentially, and this is fundamental to your understanding of this topic, please forget about talking about domestic corporations, however large they are, they don't have access to this market. These are global corporations, transnational corporations of the like of Rio Tinto or Fiat or Hyundai, or from China, Alibaba, or Mitsubishi from Japan, or Kazakhmys from Kazakhstan. That kind of global multinational is the only borrower you would expect to see in these markets. Or you'll have sovereign states, countries themselves borrowing funds in the markets, or state corporations like Petrobras. I don't know what happened, but never mind. Indian Oil, Petrobras, that kind of state corporation. EDF from France, that kind of corporate entity, which is the borrower. Now remember, it's a syndicate lending to the borrower, not one bank, but a whole number of banks. And they're lending for long periods of time. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, sometimes 50 years. And the key point is that despite the length of the loan, despite the size of these syndicated loans, they are all done on an unsecured basis. No security is asked for or taken. That takes this kind of structure, this kind of lending completely outside what happens in domestic markets. Because in domestic markets, most times banks will take security over assets. It doesn't happen here because Rio Tinto or Hyundai, if you ask for security, will say, next syndicate, please, go away. So it doesn't happen. It's unsecured lending. Now, you would have noticed by now that I talked about the currencies that are being used in these markets. US dollars, euros, yen, Singapore dollars, Australian dollars, whatever, and the renminbi in the future, very near future, I hope. But what is important is that these banks which are lending, these currencies, are lending perhaps in a currency which is not the currency of their deposit home base. In other words, US banks could be lending yen, Japanese banks could be lending euro, Chinese banks could be lending dollars. It's not the home state currency that's being used by the banks. Market feature that emanates from that fact is that banks in the global markets for syndicated loans are drawing those currencies which they're lending from somewhere else, from somebody else. And that place is in fact what is called the global interbank market, which is largely centered in London. I think I gave you the stats a month ago, 3 weeks ago, and you can remember how massive it was, even on a daily basis, what numbers we're talking about. But that's where the funding is obtained. The syndicate banks will be obtaining their dollars, their yen, their Singapore dollars, or whatever it is they're lending from this global interbank market. So essentially, what you're looking at is a structure like this. I think I've already shown you this when I was introducing syndicated loans. You have your single borrower, you have a whole pile of banks, US, German, Japanese, Canadian, etc. banks, lending a whole number of different currencies from Swiss francs to euros to US dollars. And because these are not potentially the home state currency of a bank in the syndicate, they will obtain that funding, i.e. obtain the funding to lend from the global interbank market, most of which is located here in London. That creates the need for a whole number of legal structures to deal with the fact that they're getting the funding from the interbank market and lending to a borrower. And why is that important? You're lending for 30 years here to a borrower, but how long are you getting the money from the interbank market for? Answer, in practice, no more than 9 months max. So you're getting the money for 9 months and you're on lending for 30 years. How we deal with that in the context of the legal documentation, we will come to in detail, okay? But it is a feature of the market. So, next question. So what is different about a syndicated loan, apart from the factors that we just talked about? The most important of them is that the banks are lending in currencies which are not the currency of their deposit base. Like I said, Japanese banks lending US dollars and US banks lending euros, as an example. Consequently, when you look at the legal documentation, which we will look at shortly, you'll find that there are legal mechanics, clauses, terms and conditions which are included in the syndicated loan agreement to deal with this issue. Secondly, I said that it's one single loan agreement amongst 200 banks or 150 banks or however they are, how many they are. They're all subject to a single set of clauses, terms and conditions. But there are two factors that you have to bear in mind. That although this massive loan by a huge number of banks is documented under one syndicated loan agreement, the loans which are being made to the borrower by the 150 banks, each bank is making a several independent loan to that bank, all contained in a single document. That might lead you to the conclusion that, therefore, a syndicated loan is nothing more than a collection of individual loans put into a syndicated loan agreement subject to the same terms and conditions. Is that correct? No. Because the syndicated loan mechanics, in legal terms, is integrated in a number of scenarios. First of all, most important one, the decisions that have to be taken in relation to the loan and the borrower can only be taken by a syndicate majority as defined. And the most important decision, obviously, is the calling of default by the banks on a borrower who fails to pay interest and or principal. Now that decision, the most important one in relation to the borrower's position, cannot be taken by a single bank or a group of banks. It has to be a majority of banks. I'll come to the default mechanics later, but I'm just going to give you a basic on it. It is this, that insofar as a bank wants to call a default on a borrower, it must get a majority of banks as defined to call default by a voting procedure contained in the syndicated loan agreement. Now, majority of banks is determined not by the number of banks, but by reference to the total aggregate amount which has been loaned by each of the banks. So it's an aggregation of the value of the loans which gives or produces the majority which is entitled then to call a default. I'll come to that in detail, but I mentioned this at this stage. The second reason to talk about these are not just individual loans is what is known as a pro rata sharing clause. The second major point at which the several distinct loans by individual banks become integrated under the terms of the syndicated loan agreement. It's known as the pro rata sharing clause. How does that work? I'm going to give you a very short answer to that. We'll get to it later in detail. The pro rata sharing clause provides that if any bank in the syndicate receives payment by the borrower by way of repayment of the loan, that bank is subject to an obligation to share that loan recovery with all the other banks, pro rata. Thus, if you think about it, you can't call a default without a majority, and secondly, when you call a default and you recover, well, you can't walk away with your funding, you've got to share it on a pro rata basis with all the other banks. So to that extent, the syndicated loan, although it's several and individual looked at from the point of view of the lenders, there are legal mechanics inside the syndicated loan agreement which integrates the whole structure, making it a single integrated loan which is being made by several banks on an individual basis. So that's the second major feature about the syndicated loan, which makes it quite different from other types of lending activity. The third I've already mentioned, but let's be clear. The syndicated loan is completely unsecured in the markets. There's only one exception to this rule, and that is syndicated loans in project finance, where every loan in project finance is secured financing. But if you put to one side project finance syndicated loans, all other syndicated loans in the global markets are unsecured. That requires, therefore, I'm glad there's lecture capture. I don't know how you guys are going to manage at this rate, wandering in, wandering out. Okay, I'm going to repeat this for your benefit. Please don't think you can read the book and do it, okay? Don't. It's not going to work. This is what all of us did as undergraduates. Read the book and you can manage it. Skip the lectures, go on holiday. Can't be done, okay? You're going to get into serious trouble in a couple of weeks. Not from me, but from your own understanding of the topics. So please try and work with it. You can't walk into a meeting in real life, can you? After two people have presented their papers and you're going to say, oh, my view is blah. You would know what the heck has been said before you. So let's try and do it in a slightly more organized way, okay? Okay, anyway, it's unsecured lending. But that means further terms and conditions in the syndicated loan agreement, legal clauses, legal terms, which seek to deal with this unsecured nature of the loan. Because as you might have worked out, if a loan is unsecured, the borrower goes into default, what is the protection that the banks have got? How will they recover these funds? That may not even be possible. So, the terms of the syndicated loan agreement actually contains a whole number of clauses which are based on this market feature, that this is unsecured lending. We'll look at those in some detail, but it is a feature you need to remember. Finally, last but not least, I've been talking about a whole number of banks which are getting together to make this syndicated loan to a single borrower. Kind of gives you the impression that everybody is equal in this loan. And here's the market feature which is reflected in the legal clauses. They're not. There is one or possibly two banks which run the show, which control the entire operation, control the entire transaction. The rest of the banks simply slot in and work with that bank, called the lead manager. Sometimes co-lead managers if there's more than one. But of a total of 100 banks or 150 banks, you will have one bank or two banks or three banks which will control the entire transaction and how it works. If you've got a question, please ask. If you've got a question, please ask. I'm trying to break some really bad habits you guys have got. It ain't going to work out there, and it ain't going to work here, to use John Wayne phraseology. Okay? You can't do it. You know what happens at a meeting? 40 lawyers, unless you are listening to what another lawyer is saying, if you start babbling shortly afterwards, you look stupid, idiotic, because you wouldn't know what this other lawyer would have said. And therefore, we all learn to concentrate and listen to every word that's being said at a meeting. We don't talk to my friend on my right or my friend on my left. I listen, because the only way it can get done. And these are lectures which are exactly the same way. You can't follow it, put your hand up and say, I'm sorry, I'm not following it, could you explain that? We're not going to get this done otherwise. Okay? Please do not turn to your neighbor. He's not going to be able to help you, you'll simply disturb your neighbor. You're not going to achieve anything other than disturbing your neighbor. Just ask. I'm standing right here, all you got to do is raise your hand and say, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that, what is the position? Just ask. Okay, moving on. The lead manager, as I said, controls the entire transaction, or its co-lead managers, i.e. more than one bank acting as lead manager. They will control the entire transaction and the way this transaction is put together in the markets. And therefore, they occupy, both in terms of commercial reality and most importantly for you and me as lawyers, the legal clauses in the syndicated loan agreement reflect that central role of the lead manager. Okay, so these are the things that are important in terms of how a syndicated loan agreement begins to start looking very different from ordinary loan agreements. What I want to do next is to walk you through something really practical. It's a syndications process in the global markets. How does it work? Do people wake up one morning and say, okay, let's make a $30 billion loan, or is there something that happens? Well, once again, I mentioned in the previous 5 minutes the central role of a lead manager, and here it comes again. The entire syndications process is commenced by the lead manager. Unlike in domestic transactions where people or companies go to a bank and say, please, may I have a loan? It's not the way it goes in the global market. It's the other way around. Global banks like Deutsche Bank or Mizuho or BNP Paribas or Citibank will actually go to potential borrowers. It's called pre-mandate marketing. They would have done their work to find out which corporations or which sovereign states actually need funding like now or in the next 2 months. And based on their analysis, they will pitch up at the headquarters of a corporation or a state or a central bank or a state corporation and say, right guys, here we've done the analysis, you need to borrow like now. It's the best time to do it, in dollars or in euros. And then there'll be a discussion about is yen better than dollars or are euros better than... Are you taking international finance? Are you taking the module international finance? Are you taking the module law of international finance? You just missed half an hour. Okay. Well, I'm glad you won't be going to Clifford Chance in this way. You won't have a job within about 2 days. Okay, so pre-mandate marketing. The lead managers, prospective lead managers will go pitch up to Hyundai or the government of Kazakhstan and say, look, it's time for you to borrow, and we advise you to do the following. And that would, as I said, be based on the analysis that the banks would have done in relation to each borrower. Now, it does mean, however, that you, for example, Deutsche, will be competing against BNP Paribas, will be competing against Nomura for this business. So, in order for the borrower, potential borrower, to make a decision easily, each syndicate, potential syndicate, will put together a term sheet. You've come across this term before, but let's understand what it is. The term sheet is one which is agreed, not as a legal agreement, between the syndicate lead and the prospective borrower. The lead manager or prospective lead manager will put down in that term sheet all of the important terms and conditions which the borrower and the lead manager and the syndicate will need to agree at a future time. Okay. How much, what currencies are being loaned, what are the major terms of the syndicated loan agreement. In other words, we call them heads of terms, not clauses, but actual heads of terms, short, brief statements. And of course, the all-important governing law and jurisdiction. Now, if the borrower is, potential borrower, is happy with one term sheet more than the others, it will decide to grant what is called a mandate based on the term sheet to a prospective lead manager. That's the mandate. What is the mandate? It is a mandate to raise a syndicated loan in the amount specified in the term sheet in accordance with the terms set out in the term sheet. That's the mandate. Now, that might sound like a very legal document, a very legal agreement. It isn't. It is always subject to contract and therefore without legal liability, at least under English and New York law, which are the usual governing laws which are used for syndicated loan agreements. The mandate will obviously contain all the main clauses, terms, conditions, financial terms, the currency to be loaned, etc., and the fees to be paid to the banks. Not just interest, fees to be paid to the banks. Now, let's just try and slot in what we've been saying so far with what we know. Subject to contract and formal signing of loan documentation is the formula used in every term sheet, in every other document going forward until the actual syndicated loan agreement is signed. Question that we have to think about is, what is the effect, impact of that formula? Well, we know that as a matter of English or New York law or any other common law system, it means no legal liabilities, no legal obligations until the final syndicated loan agreement is formally signed. But that is not true under many other law systems. In particular, if after the term sheet and mandate, but before the formal documentation for the syndicated loan agreement is signed, the negotiations break down, and that's the end of the matter. Under English and New York law, the answer is, well, so be it, or under Singapore law, under Hong Kong law, under most common law systems. But that's not true in relation to Japan or Germany or France. That potential problem, which means that there could be liability on the part of whoever did something, said something, which resulted in the breakdown of the negotiations, being liable in law, in damages, to the other party. If other law systems were to apply, has partially been dealt with, and I put it at that level, within the EU at least. Because what the EU has done, again, another example of model code lawyering in the EU, namely that the EU's Rome II, remember Rome II last week? Yep, it's back again. You were sleeping on it, or you were in Rome, you got a problem. What I meant was, remember what I said? Everything seeps into everything else. Here's example one, but there'll be more. Rome II provides a regime which requires recognition by all states within the EU that the law which controls liability for breakdown in negotiations will be the law which was to be used in the final documentation in the syndicated loan agreement, SLA. How do we know what that law is? Answer, it's in the term sheet and the mandate. Thus, Rome II therefore locks into market practice and says, once you've indicated what law was going to govern the syndicated loan agreement when it's signed, will also control liability for breakdown in communications. Sorry, not communications, negotiations, I'm sorry. So what you'd have then is that if the final syndicated loan agreement is to be governed by English or New York law, that law will decide whether there's liability for breakdown in negotiations prior to the signing of the loan agreement. Therefore, if you're in a German court, an Italian court, the answer is no, there will not be liability on the basis of domestic German law principles or Italian law principles, usually called culpa in contrahendo. So that is now taken out of the market, and the control of the documentation is handed over to the law system which was to be chosen in the SLA and specified in the term sheet and mandate. That's in Article 14.3. Okay, my next question. How many of you understood what I've been talking about and how many of you don't? You're okay. Good. Great. That's good to hear. Yeah, please do.
I have written about this
Culpa in contrahendo.
So basically, as much as I understand the British and the US law.
Not British. There's no such thing as British law. It's English law.
Yeah, English and
The Scots will be horrified if you call them. Yeah, just go ahead.
so they don't put any of such liability or breakdown of negotiations, and maybe if it was under German law, then maybe there would.
If it was under German law, you would then have the doctrine of culpa in contrahendo,
So I would like.
creating liability if the negotiations break down before final documentation is signed. Yes. The markets don't want that. Reason, once again, certainty and result predictability. Fundamental to your Deutsche Banks, fundamental to your Mizuhos and your banks in the marketplace. Therefore, now you've got it. We're clear about common law jurisdictions from the US to Canada to Australia, New Zealand, no liability. No liability under English law, no liability under New York law, but wait, German law, French law, Italian law, there could have been. Now that possibility is taken out because of Rome II. Exactly, because you have specified English or New York law in the term sheet. Okay, moving on. Next stage, after the mandate, what happens is that the lead manager who's been given the mandate will decide which banks are going to lend how much. Everybody doesn't lend equally in a 10 billion loan. Some will lend 500 billion, others will lend 1.5 billion, and so on and so forth. Others will lend 300 billion. So the syndicate lead, once again, in complete control of the process, will say, right, you're getting 300 million, you're getting 1 billion in terms of your lending potential for in the loan. It will also, the syndicate lead will also decide the fees to be paid to each party in the syndicated loan. I mean, to you and me as lawyers, no big deal. We simply say, so what are the fees? And we put it in a clause in the syndicated loan agreement. But to the banks in the place, it is utterly important. Why? Because we'll come to the fees clauses later, but just to give you a feel for it, fees are graded. Fees and commissions are graded. So, for example, banks lending smaller amounts of money will get, say, 1% of the total value. Others will get 1.5%, and you get the commission structure going up. So the lead manager, by the way, not only gets a commission because it will be lending the largest portion of it, but it will also get one more payment for leading the syndicate. So it's a lead manager commission. And believe it or not, on top of that, there's another payment to the lead manager by the borrower. By now, we as lawyers have run out of words in English. So we use a Latin word. That always helps. It's called a praecipium. What does it mean? Another fee. In fact, that's what it means in Latin as well. With fee. So that fee structure is then communicated to the potential syndicate banks. Yeah.
What size which currency will be used by each bank?
Which?
Currency will be used by each
Okay, I think you, thank you for asking because you're lost. Let me take you back, okay? I'm glad you're asking. Wait.
No. You said the syndicated loan is multi-currency, but when you say, okay, Mizuho Bank will lend 1 billion, this will be 1 billion multi-currency or 1
The
billion
lead manager will specify that.
in
No.
euros?
Say, for example, this is a syndicated loan where the currencies being used are euros, dollars, Australian dollars, and anything else. Let's say Mizuho says, I will lend 1 billion US. I'm not lending yen. The lead manager will decide whether that bank, Mizuho, will get that request granted. Yeah, and then that's the currency it will lend. If it opts to lend dollars, it will get dollars. It can opt to lend whatever it wants, but the final decision is with the lead manager. That's why you have this allocation of syndicate participations. Okay. It is at that point that we as lawyers get hauled in, because then you need to get the legal documentation prepared in a form that can be signed by everybody. On the basis of the mandate and the term sheet. That's when the lawyers are brought in to draft it all. Cancel holidays, forget the fact that your grandmother is in hospital, you're back at work. No, I'm being serious. This is the way it works, real life. Oh, God, my phone. Sorry, give me a sec, okay? Oh, good, it's gone. In preparing the legal documentation, in real life, people don't start drafting 150 pages of legal documentation every time. Every major bank in the global marketplace, whether it's a JP Morgan, whether it's a Nomura, has got its standard form, which they can then amend, adjust, and use for that particular syndicated loan. But they tend to have them. Their own standard form documentation. The same is true of global corporations. They too have got their syndicated loan agreement. If they are regular borrower in the markets, they have it drafted by Linklaters or Cliffords or whoever it is, and they've got it. And then, of course, what happens is the banks want to use theirs, the borrower wants to use theirs, and so you get paid a lot of money because you'll be sitting in a meeting room arguing about clause after clause after clause. The longer they argue, the better for you. But that's the process that happens. Now, there is obviously, therefore, a whole number of global market standard syndicated loan agreements which are being used. Having said that, they are all reasonably similar. Drafting is sometimes different, but the clauses are pretty much the same in terms of the headings. Every one of them will have the same types of clauses. Because of this, what has happened is that in order to enable borrowers who do not have sophisticated and individualized loan documentation developed by the Clifford Chances or Linklaters, the London Market Association's Master Syndicated Loan Agreement is available if you want to use it. Nobody does, but, sorry, I shouldn't say nobody does, people do. But it's not a standard form, and please don't treat it as a standard form. It is helpful in one way. If you want to see what the detailed clauses are like, press the button on the LMA agreement on your computer and you can see it, okay, if you want to look at it. Okay, so that's the process. And when the documentation is agreed upon, obviously it's signed by everybody. Now, something else happens which is very important prior to the signature of the syndicated loan agreement. Sometimes we have in the markets borrowers who are new to the market, or borrowers who don't borrow every 2 years. You'd be surprised. Many borrowers just keep on turning up every 2 years and keep on borrowing. Others don't. So for new or infrequent borrowers in the markets, lead manager will usually put together another document called the information memorandum. What is the information memorandum? Well, as the name says, it contains all the financial and business information, management information, future strategy, etc., relating to the borrower. Okay? That's what it contains. It's quite a thick document. Contains all the business, financial information of the borrower, and that includes obviously 3, 4, 5 years of financial statements of the borrower, balance sheet and accounts and all that. And this is distributed to banks which have said, we'd like to join your syndicate, please, in order for those banks to see what they're lending to. Now, in practice, this document is prepared by the borrower and the lead manager and reviewed by the borrower's external counsel, the lead manager's external counsel, lead manager's internal counsel, and borrower's internal counsel. So a whole pile of lawyers are involved in getting this thing together. And once agreed, it's distributed to banks which are hoping to join the syndicate. Now, I don't need to say this by now. You as lawyers would have realized it. This is a huge document full of information being winged out across the globe to potential syndicate banks. That creates potential liability, and we need to look at it a little bit more. Now, in order to minimize potential liability, the information memorandum is prepared only after a due diligence process. What is a due diligence process? Well, it's a process of gathering information about the borrower and then testing it, verifying it, making sure that the information that's going to be included is, as far as possible, totally true and accurate. And that means sitting down with the borrower's accountants, the borrower's surveyors, borrower's valuers, the borrower's management, and talking this thing through to get it right. You'll be amazed how important this is. You think borrowers are, generally speaking, people who tell exactly the truth as it is. Well, sometimes yes, and rare occasions no. I remember one which turned up as the largest airport in Southeast Asia. And we thought, really? I haven't heard of this one. So I was an associate then. My partner said, get on a flight, go have a look at this place. So 2 of us turned up there to look at the Dana airport, to make sure it was the largest airport in that region. And we stood there for 2 hours and 2 planes landed. And we thought, well, that can't be right, because Singapore, Changi, is in that region, as is Bangkok. So we knew that it was not quite accurate. So we said, look, guys, here are the statistics for Changi. That's the airport in Singapore, by the way. Here's the statistics for Bangkok. How do you compare? And of course, the answer was they were doing 10%. So the information memorandum had to be redone to reflect accuracy. So that's what we mean by saying due diligence. Check it out. Check the facts. Because that's the one way in practice to reduce liability. Okay, so you've done all that. What else can you do? Oh, sorry, before that. Okay, let me just try and walk you through the next phases before I talk about the information memorandum in detail. So the information memorandum is sent out, everybody has agreed what they're going to lend, and that's when formally the syndicate is formed and the loan documentation is signed. Now you might think the moment the loan documentation is signed, funds are disbursed to the borrower. The answer is no, it doesn't happen. Something else needs to be done before funds are disbursed. And what that something is contained in clauses in the syndicated loan agreement. They're called conditions precedent, which provide that the borrower will only receive funds under the syndicated loan agreement, which has now been signed, if it provides the following documents. That covers everything from corporate constitutional documents to exchange control permissions to valuations, blah, 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 blah. We'll look at what they are shortly, but for the moment, that's what it is. Conditions precedent have to be satisfied. And the lead manager, once again, takes on the role to say, yes, I'm satisfied that conditions precedent have now been fulfilled by the borrower. Only then will the funds be transferred. Something else happens when conditions precedent are satisfied in this process. The lead manager, that's what we've called this entity so far, the bank so far, in the legal documentation, then it transforms its role into what is known as the agent bank in the syndicated loan agreement. So lead manager inevitably becomes, in the syndicated loan documentation, in the syndicated loan agreement, the agent bank. And as agent bank, assumes a large number of responsibilities, which we will look at a later point in time. We are still walking through the process of putting together a syndicated loan. Yeah? Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier this information memorandum, and we need to look at that a little bit more. Because, as I said earlier, the information memorandum creates potential legal liability. For what? For misrepresentation of facts contained in the information memorandum. And you might say, well, you can deal with it. The borrower is liable. Isn't the borrower liable? Absolutely. And there's an express clause in the syndicated loan, every syndicated loan agreement, which says that the borrower represents and warrants that every statement in the information memorandum is true and accurate to his knowledge. And secondly, that if there's any inaccuracy in the information memorandum, the banks may call a default on the borrower. So it's a pretty hard condition, a hard term. The reality, however, is quite different. Because if the information memorandum is inaccurate, by the time banks discover the inaccuracy, it's too late. The borrower is in serious financial trouble and probably unable to pay back these huge loans that it has taken. Consequently, in practical terms, another pillar of liability is looked for by the banks, and that pillar is the lead manager, because the lead manager was involved in preparing the info memorandum with the borrower. So in practice, that's where banks will look. There's been one case, and please don't read it, where it happened, where UBS and the European American Banking Corporation way back in 1984, where the lead manager was sued by the other syndicate banks. That's just an example. Don't read the case, not terribly important. I just need you to know that it can happen. So, next question is, well, how do we reduce the potential liability of the lead manager for any misinformation contained in the information memorandum? Answer is that it's twofold in practice. Twofold defense for the lead manager. One is a set or series of clauses contained in the information memorandum itself. The second are a series of clauses contained in the actual syndicated loan agreement itself to provide exculpation of liability for the lead manager, i.e. no liability in the lead manager. So let's look at that in a bit of detail. How does this work? There's your standard disclaimer. By the way, don't copy it. It's in something similar is in my book. You don't need to copy all this down. But I've just highlighted in different colors the key points in this clause. This is the clause put into nearly every information memorandum. In particular, it says, we have been asked to put together a syndicated loan agreement, and we have compiled information to be distributed, but, key point, all information set forth herein relating to the borrower has been supplied by the borrower, i.e. nothing to do with me, guys, it comes from the borrower. And, secondly, the contents have not been independently verified by the managers, meaning the lead managers. We have not even looked at it. Nothing to do with us. Nor have they verified that all information material to an evaluation of the credit facility has been included. We haven't done any verification. We haven't checked. We've done nothing. And next, no representation of warranty express or implied is made by the managers with regard to, one, the completeness of the information memorandum, i.e. that all relevant information is included, and B, the accuracy of this memorandum. It goes on. Managers do not undertake to review the financial condition or affairs of the borrower, nor to advise other banks, other lenders, as to whether some information is relevant, not relevant, or should be looked at. And next, the memorandum is not intended to provide the sole basis of any credit or other evaluation and should not be considered as a recommendation by the managers. And then comes an even more important one. In determining whether to participate, i.e. as a syndicate bank, in this syndicated loan agreement, each lender is required to make its own assessment of the relevance and adequacy of the information contained in this memorandum and to make any independent investigations it deems necessary to join the syndicate. You see how far it goes? To say, nothing to do with us, we haven't verified it, we're not saying that this is true or false or anything, you have got to verify it. You, the syndicate bank, receiving the information memorandum. And of course then there's the usual, you will not copy it and you will not give it to anybody else clause. Right? That all looks wonderful, doesn't it?
Is that enough under common law to, avoid any liability?
I'm about to go into that question.
At the end of the day, what it says is basically that the lead manager didn't do what
I don't think we should ever, in this market, with the level of lawyering that we are talking about, treat this as just one line. It ain't. Every sentence carries weight. Every word carries weight. Do not broad brush it. Do not look at the spirit. This is, remember, English or New York law. We're not concerned with the spirit, the objective, the purpose, just what are the words used. Therefore, words are very important in terms of how this works. But you raised a good point. Does this work under English law? And here's the next question. Why English law? Let me just come to that question in a minute by trying to pinpoint the main structural points in this clause. First of all, there is the denial of authorship, i.e. we, the lead manager, co-managers, have nothing to do with this information. It all comes from the borrower. We are just a post box. We take it from the borrower and give it to you. Post box. Next, we haven't verified anything. Another main plank in this clause. We haven't verified anything, any of the information contained in the information memorandum. It also tells every syndicate bank, we don't even know whether all relevant information has been included, whether or not material information has been included. And very importantly, it's saying we haven't verified, you, each syndicate bank, will have to verify the information memorandum yourselves. We're not doing it for you. Those are the 4 planks, the structural planks of that language. But please look at the language. It is important. Now, that's the language in the information memorandum. That language is strengthened by contractual clauses in the syndicated loan agreement, in the same form as the language in the information memorandum. So you've got 2 potential defenses in the hands of the lead manager. 1, the clauses in the information memorandum, and 2, the clauses in the syndicated loan agreement. Let's look at each separately. First point, and I think that your point is we need to think about, how do we approach this? Well, question is, what law controls potential liability for inaccuracies or misleading information in the information memorandum? And that would be either a tort under common law, delict under civil law, or a civil wrong in other jurisdictions. That's what it will be. But question, what law? Well, depends on where you are in terms of liability. If you're in the US and need not be a New York law control document, it could be an English law control document, but the information memorandum liability is reviewed by a US court. What do they do? Well, answer is found in the American restatement, the second restatement of the Conflict of Laws. It says that the law to be applied to liability and therefore to that clause in the information memorandum is the law system with which the transaction has its closest connection. An extremely vague, nebulous rule, which leaves you in the air as to what the hell the law system is that applies to determine liability. And secondly, the validity of that information memorandum clause. If you're in the EU, any one of the EU countries, Rome II has got a particular clause which is of fundamental importance. Okay, just to wake you up, what is that rule? Okay, let's take the primary rule first. The primary rule is this one. It says that the law of the place where the damage is suffered, or to use Latin, lex loci damni, is what determines liability for this misrepresentation, i.e. where the damage has been suffered by somebody. Unless, and this is a secondary one, the tort or delict or civil wrong is more closely connected with another country. So it's a dual rule that's applicable. Now, if you go to the common law, which means everybody other than the UK, the old English law rule was that it was the lex loci delicti, the place where the wrong was committed, not where the damage was suffered, but where the tort, the civil wrong was committed, unless the tort had a connection with another country. Now, this is all wonderful, isn't it, in theory? How do you decide this? Let's say you're sitting in Tokyo or you're sitting in London, and this information memorandum goes out to Singapore, to Shanghai, to Buenos Aires, to Mexico City by email or with a Word document. What law controls? Answer depends on which court in which country is looking at it. And that's why we are stuck with so many different rules. Luckily, at least now in the EU, we've got the Rome II rules applicable to non-contractual obligations. Right. Just to jog your memory, what is that rule that we talked about last week? See what I mean? This is the stuff that you should have followed last week. It's now into this stuff. You can't follow what happens under the information memorandum exculpation exemption clause unless you followed what I said last week. This is just to drive the point home. You cannot treat this module as a set of separate, independent little silos. Ignore some and just study some. Can't be done. But let's go back. So, what is the EU regime applicable that we talked about last week? Yeah, please do.
The parties can agree upon in writing in the contract which law is going to be applicable to non-contractual obligations.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's absolutely right. So that's really what we've got. Article 14 permits an express choice of law by agreement between the parties. But there's another phrase which has got to be looked at rather carefully. So first point, can be agreed by the parties, i.e. the lead manager and the syndicate banks, as to what law will control any tort, civil wrong, or delict that arises in the context of the income memorandum by a special clause. But hang on, there's a little bit more. By an agreement entered into after the event giving rise to the damage occurred. When is that? What is the event which gives rise to the damage? What do you think it is? What is the event that would give rise to the damage? Okay, let's concentrate on the damage. The damage is obviously false information memorandum, borrowers in financial difficulty, banks can't recover their loans, banks suffer financial loss. That's at least clear. The loss is that. But where should this clause be, and when does the event giving rise to damage occur? Yeah, please do.
When it defaults because the information
Well, Don't forget, it's an express choice of law by an agreement between the parties, by an agreement entered into after the event giving rise to the damage occurred. It's not the damage. It's the event giving rise to the damage, i.e. causing the damage. What do you think that? Yeah. Is it the signing of the memorandum? Suppose I just signed it and put it in my pocket and did nothing. Wait, let me just... Yeah, please, go ahead. It doesn't become binding, ever. The memorandum is not a contractual document. It's an informational document. So when do you think the event occurs which causes damage? Okay. Anybody else have a view on this? Yeah, please go ahead.
The receipt.
The receipt of the IM, okay? Anyone thinks it's the distribution of the IM? When they drafted it. Is that an event giving rise to damage? Okay, you draft it, put it in your pocket. Nope, nothing. Sorry, you guys had something to say. You think it should be the distribution? Anybody has another viewpoint? Yeah. Why does the syndicated, not single loan, syndicated loan agreement be the event giving rise to the damage? The syndicated loan agreement doesn't give rise to any damage. What is causing the damage is the misinformation which people have relied on, banks have relied on, in consequence of which the borrower is not the borrower it is supposed to be, and the banks suffer loss because the borrower is in a weak financial position and cannot repay the loans. So the damage, if you think about it, is the inability of the borrower to repay the loans, resulting in the banks not receiving repayment on the loan. That's the damage. Now what causes this whole process to start? Answer, it has to be an event agreement between the parties entered into after the event giving rise to the damage occurred. I mean, most people would say that's the distribution of the memorandum. Because that's the event which gives rise to the damage. Why? Because banks are relying on it, they read it, they rely on it, they enter the SLA, and boom, it all goes bad. Yeah, please do. Sorry?
In the beginning, when the term sheet is the first,
Yeah.
I remember. So maybe this time is considered that when this borrower agrees about the term sheet, kind of like everything here.
But if you stop the clock, term sheets agreed. Who suffers damage?
No one suffers damage, but then maybe.
Wait, no, think it through.
Everything is so
No,
complicated.
wait. Of course it's complicated.
Yeah.
That's why lawyers are paid vast amounts of money to get it right. Let's just think this through. If you're looking at the term sheet, what damage does the term sheet result in?
Not term sheet. When
Okay.
I say that, okay, I like this, and then it's about borrower as much time.
Okay.
So, yeah, I like it, so I should give you my IM.
No, you don't. If the term sheet is acceptable to the borrower grants a mandate,
Yeah.
subject to contract, to the lead manager to raise the finance in the markets.
So before when it decides to give the mandate.
What is the damage that's caused by giving a mandate? No, but that's the analysis you have to do. How come that's going to cause damage simply by the borrower saying, hey, I'm going to give you a mandate?
Yeah, because he knows already that he's not, he can pay back. So basically, this
No, I mean, you're thinking about some kind of fraud. No, you're not. We're not talking about that. You're talking about a borrower whose financial condition is not as reflected in the information memorandum, or the business structure is wrong, whatever it is. That need not be fraud. That could be simple carelessness and negligence, which is usually the case. Because these are huge corporations. They don't go around committing fraud. Well, give or take Enron. Okay. But I think it's important to focus on this, because I think that you need to bring yourself within this language. If an Article 14 clause is going to be relied on by the lead manager, the lead manager must be able to show it falls within this language. I've got an agreement entered into after the event giving rise to the damage occurred. Otherwise, it has no benefit of Article 14. So you want to rely on Article 14, you'd better say, here's the agreement, and that agreement was entered into after the event giving rise to the damage occurred. Otherwise, you can't. Yeah?
In case you don't have a new or infrequent borrower, and we don't have any information memorandum, what is the event?
Okay. There is no event because there is no information memorandum. There's no liability. Nothing has been distributed. If you're talking Microsoft, if you're talking Daimler-Benz, if you're talking China Petroleum Corporation, a regular borrower in the markets, an information memorandum would not be prepared. Thus, nothing is distributed. Thus, there's no damage caused by or resulting from an information memorandum. Therefore, you don't need an Article 14 clause. Okay, moving on. Anybody else got any questions? No? Okay, good. So, that's just the EU. Remember that very carefully. Do not sign Article 14, Rome 2, when you're in Japan. They haven't yet joined. Okay. Next comes the next set of clauses is to be found in the syndicated loan agreement itself. And that clause simply tracks the language that we've just talked about, meaning this language. Basically, each syndicate bank agrees that it will do its own verification of the facts and information contained in the information memorandum, that it does not rely on the lead manager or any other co-manager, and that it does not consider the information contained in the information memorandum to be a recommendation to join the syndicate, and so on. This same stuff is repeated in a contractual clause. Now I'm going to ask you a question to make you sure you're thinking. Why is that clause binding on everybody? Please do. It's a signed contractual document, but what law says it's binding? Supposing you're a Japanese borrower, I say a Japanese bank, or a Chinese bank. What law says it's binding? Or you're a French bank. Right. You're absolutely right. It is the governing law which controls that clause. Now, question then is, take those banks I just mentioned to you. Why is the governing law clause binding on a Japanese bank? Why is it binding on a French bank, German bank, Brazilian bank? Why? See what I mean about having to think about it rather than read about it? That's what you get paid for, doing the thinking, not the reading. Nobody cares how many articles you've read. So, think about it now. What law tells you all this? You're in a Japanese court. You're in an Indian court. You're in a German court. You're in a French court. You're in a US court. What law? How do we know which law controls? Term sheet. You're back with this term sheet. It's long gone now. Don't forget, the term sheet is only applicable until...
But there is syndicated government order.
Yeah?
So basically, if I said
Wait. Just stop for a second. You're now in a situation, in a timeline, where the syndicated loan agreement has been signed. The term sheet falls away because by its very terms, it says subject to contract and final documentation. It's gone away now.
then we have this one in syndicated loan agreement without.
Okay, so why is that binding on a Japanese bank? Yeah, I'm asking you why. Because it's signed. But who says because it's signed, it's binding? This is the analysis that you need to go through because you are now in a multi-jurisdictional context. You need to think much wider than a law system. Yeah, please do. I'm sorry? The law of the forum, okay? Wait, stop for a second. Let's concentrate on the EU. You just started with France. So why would a French court say, that's it, the governing law controls? What did we do in week 3? What did we do in week 3 in these lectures? Yeah, please do.
Is it Article 11 of Rule 1, the one that says formal validity?
You're right, it is Rome 1 which decides it. As far as a German court is concerned, a French court is concerned, this time we are looking at a contractual document, the SLA. Every European court cannot apply its law of the forum. It has to apply the law dictated by Rome 1, and Rome 1 says if there's an express choice of governing law, well, that's it, that's what you've got to apply and recognize, yeah? Now let's go to Japan. Rome 1 doesn't apply. What are you going to look at? Sorry? Don't say term sheet. Well, you're right in saying you need to look at the rule that's going to be applied by a Japanese court. A US court would apply the chosen express law unless that transaction has a close connection with another law system. And that's the same rule in Japan. So yes, you're right. If you're in India, you'll have the common law rule, recognize an express governing law clause, and so on. So what you're looking at, therefore, you cannot apply Rome 1 across the globe, not yet, until it's adopted by everybody else. But for EU countries, it's absolutely clear what we're doing. The contractual clauses in the SLA would be recognized under the governing law because of Rome 1. But if you're outside the EU, you need to look at similar conflict of laws rules in the US, in Japan, in China, in Thailand, wherever you are. What law would be applied? And the answer is, depends on what we call a recognition rule. Does Thai law say, we recognize an expressly chosen governing law? Does Japanese law say we recognize an expressly chosen governing law? Just the way Rome 1 does. And the straight answer to you is yes, yes, and yes. But that has to come from Japan, that has to come from whatever country that you're in. Okay? Right, moving on. But please stop me if you're not clear about what it is. So, what you're looking at, therefore, outside, in relation to the contractual clause, within EU, the Rome 1 rule of recognition. Whatever governing law has been chosen must be recognized under the governing law. Okay. Outside the EU, you're looking at the recognition rule. The recognition rule, the Japanese law says, do we recognize an expressly chosen governing law? Thai law, does it have a provision which says Thai law recognizes an expressly chosen governing law? So you're looking at a whole number of law systems in deciding whether or not the contractual clause in the SLA is going to be recognized and given effect to protect the lead manager. Are we clear? Okay, great. Any questions? Because this is not an easy area. But I'm going to make this point over and over again as I keep going. You needed to have been on top of last week's lectures to have understood this discussion today. This is how this thing builds. You can't leave one bit of it in a silo and say, okay, I can come back to it in January. Can't. Okay, and no questions? Can I move on in that case? Or are you too shell-shocked to even carry on? We should probably give everybody a shot of scotch or something. wake up. Okay. That's the process. What we've done so far is Section A. Process and legal issues when a syndicated loan agreement, a syndicated loan is being set up. All that we've talked about. We're going to get into the actual agreement itself, the SLA. Okay? So let's try and just get a bird's eye view of what's in the SLA. The legal structure of an SLA is very standard, whether it's a JP Morgan standard form, whether it's a Mitsubishi standard form, whether it is a Kazakh government standard form, will have these very same provisions and clauses. It starts with your conditions precedent, i.e. what must the borrower satisfy to get its funding. It will then have things called representations and warranties given by the borrower to the banks. It will then have the all-important financial terms. Then it will have a section called covenants, which are the conditions, terms and conditions of the syndicated loan agreement, followed by events of default. What constitutes a default by the borrower? What constitutes cross-default by the borrower? Then the provisions for termination and acceleration, meaning who can actually call a default if there is an event of default occurring. As I said earlier today, it's a majority of banks determined by the amount they have loaned, but we'll come to that. And who has a right not only to call default, but to demand repayment of all outstanding. All of that is dealt with in a separate provision. Then comes the next section in the syndicated loan agreement, the sharing clauses, including the pro rata sharing clause, which I mentioned to you, namely that if a bank gets repaid, it must share what it gets repaid with everybody else. Then there are the agent bank clauses, meaning what are the obligations, rights of the agent bank. And usually, inevitably, always, it's the lead manager who becomes the agent bank, and therefore you've got the agent bank clauses setting out what the agent must do, what are its rights, what are its obligations, and most importantly for the agent bank, what are the protections it has vis-a-vis the other banks in the syndicate. Finally comes that clause which we spent 2 lectures on, the choice of law and jurisdiction clause. It is so, to investment bankers and global corporations, so basic, nobody even discusses it because it's there. Are we going to use anything other than English or New York law is the question that comes up. So it's really not something that's widely argued, but there it is. The final provision in the syndicated loan agreement is choice of law and jurisdiction, which is a one line, and when I was an associate, that's all we were told. By the way, there is a choice of law clause and a jurisdiction clause. It says governed by English or New York law. Nobody ever told me why is it that. And that's why I spent 2 lectures getting you to grips with this. What underlies this choice? Okay, so that's the basic structure, the legal structure of a syndicated loan agreement. What I want to do next is to go through each of these sections one by one in detail. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of them, I can assure you. Let's do something easy. Conditions precedent and reps and warranties. They are the 2 easiest bits to deal with. The standard conditions precedent, which you will see in every syndicated loan agreement, is a requirement on the part of the borrower to deliver its constitutional and other founding documents. And next, to deal with that constitutional document, a legal opinion which sets out in detail and clearly status of the corporation as a legal entity under what law? Sorry, which law are we looking at now? Sorry? Law of the place of incorporation. Yeah, that's what you're looking at. So, legal opinions from lawyers in the law of the place of incorporation, dealing with status, i.e. that it's a lawfully existing corporate entity, that it's got the powers to enter into this transaction, and it's got the capacity to do so. Here's something that I think you might want to just remember in practice. You don't get legal opinions from two lawyers sitting in a house somewhere in a garden. Right across the globe, there is a network of law firms which provide these opinions. You want to work in this world, you need to join one of those law firms. Very simple. And all of us sitting here in London or New York have a little list. Press a button and say Uruguay, and up comes who we deal with in Uruguay. Press a button, Thailand, and it comes up with who we deal with in Thailand or Japan or wherever. So the legal opinions will come from those law firms which are recognized by the global law firms as being able to provide hard legal opinions. Now, this is not a hard legal opinion or difficult legal opinion to provide. It's status, capacity, and powers. And so it's not a difficult one to provide. But the reason why you have this network of law firms providing legal opinions in the global markets is very straightforward. When you get out there one day, in about 8 months' time or 9 months' time, and you see one of these legal opinions, you'll see why you go to Pinheiro Neto in Brazil or Nagashima and Ono in Japan. They're crafted legal opinions. Not the kind of stuff that you get when you ask some law firm which is not one of these selected law firms, where you get a ding-dong running into 8 pages and you're saying, what the hell is this person saying? Our code says this, our code says that, blah, blah, blah. 8 pages later and you're saying, have you answered my question? The answer is no, you haven't. That's why these law firms are selected for their clarity and precision in terms of the advice they provide. And that's why I said, if you want to work in this world, you really do need to think about who in your home state is doing this work. I can't tell you that because that would be unfair. But there are law firms in every country, from China to Japan to Brazil to Mexico, which do this work and do provide the opinions and do provide the input into the global markets and the global law firms. Okay, third one, the third condition precedent, that all relevant exchange control permissions, where relevant, have been obtained. As I said last week, many countries have exchange controls, preventing a corporate entity from its home country from borrowing foreign currency, or indeed repaying a loan which it has obtained. That kind of exchange control permission is the subject of this condition precedent, saying, if you need exchange control permission, we need to see it. We need to see the formal certification by the central bank or other authority saying, yes, you can borrow this loan in Canadian dollars or euros or whatever the currency is. And that too would be covered in the legal opinion from the borrower's home state. Then comes another very important provision, no default condition precedent, that the borrower is not already in default of either this loan agreement or other borrowings of the borrower. This is not a cross default. It simply says you need to satisfy us that you're not in default Did you just come in? Oh, right, okay, I thought, oh my God, it is an all-time record, 10 minutes before lecture over. Okay, it doesn't matter. So, the no default condition precedent, i.e. a statement that the borrower is not in default of either this loan agreement or any other loan agreement to which it is a party. Once all of these things have been set out, now depending on what loan it is, what borrower it is, the conditions precedent can change, but this is the guts, the basics. The lead manager has to certify at the end of a period of time specified in the SLA that these conditions precedent have been satisfied. In other words, the borrower will be given a window, a period of time, when it must show that it has satisfied conditions precedent. At the end of that period, if the borrower has satisfied the conditions precedent, the lead manager will certify that the conditions precedent have been satisfied. It will certify that to the other syndicate banks, and then the funds will be made available. There's a lot of discussion, I don't want you to go read it, but a lot of discussion in the academic journals about whether or not these conditions are such that borrowers and banks have what we call walk-away rights, i.e., before the conditions precedent are satisfied, but after the SLA has been signed, can the borrower say, no, I don't want your $2 billion? Or the banks are going to say, no, we're not going to lend you the $2 billion. A walk-away right. And the straight answer is no, they don't, because of the way the conditions precedent are drafted. There are no walk-away rights. So I don't think you need to get into the, seriously useless academic writing, because if you read the document, it's pretty much obvious what it says. There are no walk-away rights. Reps and warranties. Now these, in a way, are similar to the conditions precedent, although it's much wider. These are representations given by the borrower to the syndicate banks. So the first one copies pretty much the condition precedent, which says, I have the status, the capacity, and the power to engage in this transaction and to sign this syndicated loan agreement. 2, it says the borrower represents and warrants that it has got all necessary authorizations to engage in this transaction, including exchange control permission from the central bank if it's applicable. Authorizations and consents. Thirdly, it represents and warrants that the syndicated loan agreement and any other documents signed are valid and effective and is binding on the borrower under applicable governing law. It's the validity of the documentation, legal nature of the documentation as being binding on the borrower. That is made a representation. The next one is that all financial information provided by the borrower to the syndicate banks is absolutely accurate and true. If something is not true, misinformation, that's an event of default. And you've got 2 reps and warranties which are linked. The no default warranty and the no litigation warranty. Namely, the borrower is saying, I represent and warrant to you, the syndicate banks, that I am not in default either under this loan agreement or any other loan agreement to which I am party. The no default representation and warranty. And next, allied to it, is the no litigation warranty. I represent and warrant you that I am not subject to any litigation anywhere on the globe. Now, quite clearly, for a major global corporation to give that rep and warranty would be impossible, because it's got hundreds of subsidiaries and one of them could be subject to litigation somewhere. And the rep and warranty covers not only the borrower but its subsidiaries as well, no litigation. Consequently, in order to alleviate the obvious problem, what the clause will provide is that the borrower represents and warrants that it, nor its subsidiaries, is subject to any litigation anywhere on the globe, in any country, with a total aggregate value of X $100 million. Because you're not worried that somebody is being sued because they didn't return their hired car on time. What you're really concerned with is major litigation. So the representation and warranty actually deals with no litigation in total value exceeding, take your pick, 100 million, 200 million. Next, the title warranty representation. This is a representation and warranty which says the borrower represents and warrants that it has title to all of the assets appearing as the borrower's assets on the borrower's balance sheet as certified by Pricewaterhouse or whoever. It's a title warranty. So the banks know quite clearly that what is on the balance sheet is actually that of the borrower. Now, representations and warranties are by their very nature under New York law and English law binding and must be true at the time they are given, but not thereafter. What is the time at which they are given? Answer: when the syndicated loan agreement is signed. And that's not good enough for the banks, obviously. Therefore, the representation and warranty terms and conditions or provisions, clauses in the syndicated loan agreement actually converts this single set of reps and warranties to be valid on day one into what are called evergreen representations and warranties. The borrower is required to repeat the reps and warranties in the SLA, i.e. not pick up a phone, but legally required to represent and warrant over and over again that they are true whenever a new borrowing occurs or when interest rates are fixed in relation to the borrowing on what are called interest rate fixing dates, which I'll come to in a short while. Interest rate fixing dates are usually 6 months, 3 months, every 6 months, every 3 months, depending on how the syndicated loan is structured. There's an interest rate fixing date, i.e. the interest rate the borrower must pay on what it has borrowed. On those dates, when interest rates are fixed for 3 months or 6 months, the borrower is then required to repeat these same reps and warranties with regard to its status, capacity, powers, accuracy of financial information, etc., etc. Yeah?
What happens if it just so happens that the interest rates think that a new lawsuit or has defaulted on one of its
Sorry, if a law comes into...
Well, no, so say the company the borrower is borrowing has, like, in the period of signing the agreement to the first interest fixed day or second or whatever, has become subject to a piece of litigation or have defaulted on the loan agreement. Because the loan goes on for 30 years, it's still continuous.
Well, the borrower cannot, legally speaking, give the representation. What would happen in practice is that on or before, I should say before, the interest rate fixing date, when it's got to repeat the no litigation warranty, because it's now being sued in Japan for 100 million, in practice what would happen is it would go to the banks and say, guys, I've got a problem. I'm being sued in Japan or Thailand or wherever, Brazil, for this amount. And I'm going to be in breach of my rep and warranty on interest rate fixing date. The banks then have an opportunity to decide, can we live with this? Or do we need to say to the borrower, look, sorry guys, we're pulling out. Money back, please, for breach of rep and warranty. In practice, that wouldn't happen. I mean, you're talking 100 million, 150 million, they are small amounts in this world. And therefore, the banks would say, okay, that's fine, we waive this, but any more and we'll have to come back and discuss again. Sometimes banks would say, well, could you give us an affirmative opinion from a law firm in the jurisdiction in which the litigation is occurring to say that your chances of success are 60%, 70%, or none at all, whatever the assessment is. Because that would then give the banks the ability to make a judgment about what to do. But that's the practical aspect of it. And thank you for raising that question. Good question. Any other thoughts, questions? This is all very straightforward. Yeah, please.
Could you repeat the revolvers thing?
Oh, I wasn't actually going to talk about revolvers today, but since you raised it, let's. We've talked up to now about multi-currency syndicated loan agreements. We've talked about the borrower getting its funding the moment it satisfies conditions precedent. That's the standard structure. When we come to financial terms, you will find that the syndicated loan could be what is called a revolving syndicated loan, which means, and I'll look at that in some detail, the borrower has got a right to borrow any amount in any given currency specified in the SLA up to a maximum amount, up to, not the whole of it, up to, and then repay some of it during the life of the loan and re-borrow at a later point in time. That's why it's called a revolver. It's a right to borrow, repay, re-borrow. Now, if you got a revolver, the representations and warranty clause would read that on every occasion on which the borrower draws down funds under this syndicated loan agreement, it represents and warrants that. Status, capacity, powers, documentation valid, etc., etc. Because that means you've got an ongoing right as against the borrower to make sure that everything is true on each of those dates on which the borrower is exercising its rights to draw down funds under a revolving syndicated loan agreement. Okay, good. I'm glad you guys are thinking. Okay. I'm not going to get onto this. I think I better leave you guys to get things clear in your mind, but I just want to make just one legal point. Why do we call them representations and warranties? What's the difference? Anyone has a go at it? Reps and warranties. Why do we have representations and warranties? So you warrant status, capacity, and powers, and then you represent your status, capacity, and powers. Why both? Okay, I better give you the answer, right? Reason is as follows. How do we know that a corporate entity has got the relevant capacity and power to engage in a transaction? Not the term sheet. I'm joking. How do we know that it's got the status, capacity, and powers? Yeah. The law of the place of incorporation tells you that, right? Absolutely. Now, next point. If, despite this perfect legal opinion from a leading law firm in Brazil, the legal opinion is wrong and the borrowing entity does not have the capacity to engage in this agreement, what happens now? Just think it through. Yeah. Sorry? For $2 billion? Not even all their houses and children's homes and everything else will add up to that. But what is the legal impact of saying no capacity? Exactly. The loan agreement under the putative governing law would be void. Void meaning it's unenforceable. It has no legal effect at all. So what now? You just handed over $1 billion and this corporate entity you discovered, despite the firm legal opinion, actually cannot do this transaction. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly right. So what this does is to provide a claim in misrepresentation independent of and outside the four walls of the contractual agreement, which is void. It's a representation outside the four walls of the contractual document. It's an independent representation which gives rise to tort liability, to delictual liability, or a civil wrong, just the way that the information memorandum can give rise to delictual, tortious liability or a civil wrong. It's non-contractual, it's a tort, it's a delict, it's a civil wrong, whatever word you want to use. And therefore, it gives the banks the ability to pursue the borrower and recover the funds on that basis rather than a contractual basis. That's why it's a representation and a warranty. So that if everything is void because the borrower has no capacity, you still have this representation. So it can sue the borrower on the basis of civil wrong, delict, tort, whatever you want to call it. Yeah, that's why it's a representation and warranty. It's a very technical point, but it's the kind of thing that people don't think about when they're reading the loan agreement. Why we got something which says reps and warranties? Because the other terms are referred to as financial terms, covenants, default event. They're not representations. And the reason for having that as having those provisions as representations is that in addition to there being contractual obligations, they can give rise to non-contractual liability. Yeah? With me? Okay, great. Right, guys, we've got 12 minutes, but I think I'm going to call it today because next week I'm going to go into financial terms, etc. But if you haven't caught up on your Rome 1, Rome 2, American Restatement of the Conflict of Laws, do try and finish it off, okay? Oh, and next week we're into seminars. Have you looked at the fact pattern I put on Keats? You have. Good, because it's based entirely on what we've covered up to now. Nothing more. So it should be easy. But please, don't think, oh yeah, I know what that is. It's not I know what that is, it's what advice am I going to give my client, and therefore you need to write the darn thing down. Okay? Agreed? Good. I'll see you guys, some of you Tuesdays, some of you Wednesday. Right. Is there anybody here who hasn't got a seminar group assigned? I mean, every day I'm getting a seminar. Come on around, let's sort this out. Are you the only one? Everybody else has got one. You're okay? Can't hear you. 2 hours. All seminars are 2 hours. God, I'm down to 1 in terms of sorting it out. Yeah. Yep. Yes, because the misrepresentation, the misrepresentation will be the thing that would give rise to the damages claim, because the borrower is in breach of a condition or a term in the contract. It doesn't matter because the SLA is void. But the warranty is dead because it's no longer binding. Don't forget, if the SLA is void, everything is void. So the whole thing is void, therefore you will claim whatever you lost on the basis of the representation. Yeah, got it. What's your name? Ah, you're the one who's... You're the one who went to Rome, right? Did you miss any other lectures? No, I know it's your responsibility, but it's my responsibility to make sure you guys know what you're... Wait. How many lectures did you miss? Gee whiz. Okay. You really need to get to grips with it, get these lecture capture things and listen to it, okay? All right. And I will put you into which seminar group would you like? Be it Tuesday or Wednesday? Are you free on both days, Tuesday or Wednesday? You have Wednesday, you got M&A. Does that mean can you join Tuesday? Okay, done. I'll put it on Tuesday group, okay? Hi.
I previously sent you an email stating that my name was stated twice in the group.
Yours is missing as well.
No, it's not missing. It was stated twice, but then you sent me an email stating that I can join.
Okay, the most recent update will go up hopefully tomorrow morning.
Okay then.
Okay? It'll be all done. Isn't it? Wait, let me just get this out, okay? Just shut this down. You got questions? Academic questions or non-academic questions? See, when I say, any of you guys have any questions? Okay. What about it? I'm not going to give you the answer to it. You're going to find the answer. You can state an assumption, as we always do. Yeah. But if there's an info memorandum, it doesn't matter whether it's frequent or not. There is an info memorandum. Yeah. You can, but why do you want to make an assumption? If there's an information memorandum, there is one. Okay. See you guys. Sorry, who was that? Do you need to ask me a question as well? Yeah. What time? Sorry. Okay. If you sent me an email, did I respond to it? Okay, if I responded to every email that has been sent to me, and the update will go up on Keats tomorrow. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I checked the list,
Sorry?
but it's still no my name on the list. But I emailed.
Did you send me an email?
Yeah.
Okay, if you send me an email, it will be on the list tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
All right.
No, it was just a question about this information memorandum, and I'm just kind of confused because it was included in this fact pattern, but the thing is you cannot pursue any responsibility against this.
Now, why didn't you ask me this question in class when I said any questions?
Sorry.
No, I'm being serious. You guys got, I mean, otherwise I'm sitting here answering the same question 3 times. So, can you try? But yeah, go ahead
Yeah,
now.
I will try. No, it's just a question that I was kind of confused because I know that normally they include this kind of disclaimers in the documentation.
Yeah.
So if I want to pursue then the responsibility of this lead manager, then there's no chance that I can pursue the responsibility.
God, you're lost. Totally. Because you can't even frame the question. What are you asking me? Don't forget there are 2 clauses. One, the information memorandum clauses,
Yes.
and the other, the syndicated loan agreement
No,
clauses.
I'm talking about the information.
You're talking about the info memorandum clauses. Okay.
About that.
And what's the question? I still didn't understand the question.
No, it's then there's a misrepresentation
Yep.
of the facts that are included in the information
Okay.
memorandum, and I want to pursue the responsibility of the lead manager that put in all the information in this memorandum. The thing is, my understanding is that you cannot go against this lead manager because there are disclaimers included in this information.
So that's what you need to analyze. Are these disclaimers sufficient and under what law? Yeah?
Okay.
Okay. You fire away.
I was just going to ask for the 7th, did you want the opinion to be a properly drafted opinion, or are we just going to be discussing?
No, I mean, yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a drafted advice that you're going to provide. Yeah. Okay.
Because I wanted to be practical, should I set to
No. All seminars are required to be presented in class and discussed in class. Okay? All right. Yeah.
Excuse me, what's the start date of group B's?
What is the?
Start date of the group?
It's on Keats.
Is it? But it's just group A seminar.
You guys don't even read Keats. I said seminars will commence on the week beginning.
So both of this group is the same. It's all starting next week.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I just have one confusion because you said that you can choose the New York law and to be sued in the Japanese court, and therefore we need to look at the
Recognition rules of Japanese law.
yeah. Why don't we just choose the New York court or London court?
Easily done, but you could have litigation occurring in some other court other than the courts of the jurisdiction.
Yeah, I understand.
That's specified. And at that point, you get into very difficult questions about the conflict of laws as to which court has greater jurisdiction.
Yeah, well, I just mean why make the question so complicated when you can choose the easier way? Because if you just choose the any European court, you can just easily solve the question.
Not necessarily, because you can't control it. You can't control the form of litigation. You control it by a clause which says any disputes arising under this syndicated loan agreement or anything connected therewith shall be subject to the jurisdiction of the New York courts, the English courts, whatever.
Yeah.
That seeks to control it. But that can't prevent a bank from suing in the courts of Japan. And the Japanese court saying, I don't care what the clause says, I'm asserting jurisdiction.
Okay.
Yeah? That's
yeah.
the problem.
Okay, thank you.
Right. I think we can go now. I don't believe it. Oh. Wait, I'm going to ask you one simple question. Why wasn't it asked from that when I said any questions? No, but it's serious. Because otherwise I'm answering the same question again and again and again. See? Anyway, go ahead. What is it? But next time from the class or at seminar, okay? Event giving rise to the damage. It's the distribution of the information memorandum that is the event, giving right to the event.